Wind howled like a lonesome lament through the stand of sagebrush as Caleb Harrow scanned the barren horizon of Dustvale Ranch. The twilight bled rust and gossamer into the dusty plain, a time when every sound and shadow carried the secrets of the frontier. Caleb, a lean, grim rancher in his mid-30s, had long learned to keep his solitude close, scarred by the bitter taste of failure, haunted still by the memory of a friend lost in a botched cattle deal. He had built his life around the silent rhythm of survival. The ranch, with its creaking barn and smudged wooden porch, stood isolated amid a sea of arid plains and weathered earth. On that evening, as the chill deepened and dusk edged toward night, the steady clip of hooves disturbed the stillness. A creaking wagon rolled slowly up the gravel drive that led to Dustvale Ranch. Caleb's eyes narrowed as he leaned against a worn balustrade. He was accustomed to solitude and silence, yet something in the sound set his instincts on alert. Shadows danced on the horizon as the wagon stopped. From its splintered sides emerged a woman, her figure lit by the last murmurs of sun, and beside her, a young woman whose dark eyes shone with guarded resolve. The woman, Ruth Calloway, moved with the weary dignity of a widow hardened by loss. Her face was etched by sorrow and hope in equal measure. Clutched in her hand was a bundle of scant belongings, and though each step betrayed exhaustion, she carried herself with an air of quiet determination. At her side, the daughter, Nora, stood silent. Nora, nearly 19, possessed a slender frame and a severe beauty, her eyes dark pools reflecting secrets untold. Around Nora's wrist glinted a small gold locket, its surface engraved with a modest motif that hinted only at the scandal of the past, a relic of shame and betrayal that tethered her fate to secrets best left unspoken. Caleb watched as Ruth hesitated beneath the faded wooden awning of his porch. The air smelled of warm leather and dusty straw, mingled with the sharp tang of sage. His calloused hand, roughened by years working the land, trembled ever so slightly as he reached for the door latch. The knock that followed was soft yet insistent, as if echoing a plea from a life too burdened to speak. When the door swung open, Caleb met Ruth's eyes, steady yet weathered by grief, and listened as she said in a voice that carried both resignation and determination, "They ain't yours, but they need you." The words, sparse and enigmatic, struck Caleb as if from the depths of his own solitary heart. He peered at the two figures on his doorstep. The stern yet gentle eyes of the daughter, Nora, which betrayed not only a reserved sadness, but also an untapped strength, and Ruth, whose quiet plea resonated with a promise of survival. Without a word, Caleb stepped aside and invited them in. The scent of rich earth and the soft glow of a single lantern within his modest home seemed to offer an unspoken welcome. Inside, the parlor's sparse furnishings, worn chairs, and a creaking table spoke of a life lived at the margins of hardship. As Ruth and Nora entered, Caleb's gaze fell upon the locket adorning Nora's wrist. In that small, glimmering token, he sensed a story buried deep, a tale of love betrayed or a secret loss of time. Though he did not ask, his mind churned with quiet curiosity, tempered by his own unhealed wounds. Caleb led them to a rough-hewn bench by the window overlooking the vast, empty plain. The silence was heavy as each seemed to measure the other's sorrow. Ruth's eyes flickered with memories too painful to share, and Nora's gaze remained steadfast, as if challenging the world to uncover the truth behind her locket. Caleb, ever reticent, recalled the mistakes of his past, the failed cattle raid that cost him his dearest friend and the bitter shame that had driven him into seclusion. Now, faced with these newcomers, a widow and her daughter, he felt, for the first time in many long years, a faint stirring of something like responsibility, blended perhaps with a hope of redemption. Later that evening, while Ruth settled into a spare room filled with silence and the creak of old wind, Caleb moved about the main house. He inspected a section of the dilapidated barn, his mind adrift on memories of better days when laughter and life echoed through these halls. As he walked along the cool floorboards, his eyes landed on something half hidden in the corner, a length of charred rope, its fibers blackened and brittle. He nearly dropped his tool. The rope lay draped on a post, its presence inexplicable, a dark warning left by an unknown hand. Though he had no inkling who might do such a thing, the object sparked a deep unease. Outside, the wind whispered through the junipers, carrying news of far-off troubles along the plain. Caleb's thoughts turned to the small town of Iron Hollow, where gossip ran like wildfire and every newcomer was scrutinized. He imagined what they would say about Ruth and her silent, troubled daughter. Despite that, something about their arrival resonated with him. A chance to atone for his wasted days, a possible path away from loneliness. That lingering hope, however fragile, was tempered by the midnight chill that seeped into his bones as he secured the door once more. Later, gathered around a small wood stove, Caleb shared a battered, scarred knife with Ruth, a token of trust and mutual understanding forged in hardship. "This belonged to my friend," he said quietly, his voice rough like gravel, "and I never meant to keep it for myself. It's yours if you need it, if it helps." Ruth accepted it with a bowed head, her fingers grazing his for an insignificant moment that spoke loudly to both parties. It was a silent covenant, an acknowledgement that in this bleak, turbulent frontier, the sharing of burdens might just pave a way forward. Nora sat in a corner, her eyes fixed on the dancing shadows cast across the rough-hewn walls. In that moment, her silence carried volumes. Caleb, though taciturn, felt a stirring of protectiveness. His mind, haunted by ghosts of betrayal and failure, finally allowed itself to consider the possibility that perhaps, in helping these strangers, he might salvage some redeeming fragment of his own shattered soul. The night wore on slow and heavy as the fire's glow barely held back the advancing chill. Outside, the vast expanse of bitter sage lay under a dark, velvet sky, yet Caleb could not shake the feeling that far beyond, unseen eyes watched their every movement. He lingered by the window, scanning the horizon as the wind cried its mournful tune. As midnight approached, with only the low hum of the wind and the occasional crackle of the dying fire for company, Caleb's thoughts turned inward with this unanticipated alliance. This found family of a widow, her daughter, and two lost souls stand against the harsh judgments of a world that all too often left the vulnerable to rot. In that uncertain darkness, amid the solemn quiet of the ranch, every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of sagebrush outside seemed to whisper possibilities. For a long moment, Caleb sat with his head bowed, the silent weight of the charred rope and the glimmer of Nora's locket etching themselves into his mind. The subtle interplay of guilt and hope, of past betrayals and the promise of new kinship, spun a tapestry of emotions too potent to ignore. In that solitude, as the night deepened, the ranch and its new inhabitants took on the semblance of a fragile promise, one that could mend wounds with time if tended with care. As the final light of dusk dimmed into near darkness, a quiet resolve crystallized in Caleb's heart. He rose slowly, his limbs heavy with the fatigue of old battles, yet determined to face whatever the frontier might hurl his way. "They need a home," he murmured to himself, the words echoing softly against the silent walls. "And maybe, in tending to them, I'll tend to my own scars." In that resonant moment, as the wind sighed through the junipers and the ranch settled into an uneasy sleep, a question loomed in quiet, a question that will haunt him in the hours to come. Who left the charred rope? And what secret does Nora's quiet locket conceal? With the night's cold embrace and unanswered mysteries weighing on his heart, will Caleb uncover the truth behind these ominous signs before the coming dawn? Wind rattled the eaves of Dust Vale Ranch as dusk yielded its fading blue to night's uncertain embrace. Inside the modest ranch house, the quiet murmur of life began to stir anew. After the arrival of Ruth Calloway and her daughter Nora, Caleb Harrow had spent the early hours preparing for their stay. Now, the household settled into an uneasy routine amid the persistent scent of sun-baked sagebrush and old leather. In the spare room on the second floor, Ruth unpacked faded belongings with careful determination. Nora, slender and silent, rarely met Caleb's gaze. Her dark eyes lingered instead on the wooden frame of a small chest in the corner. At her wrist, the locket glinted softly under the weak light of the lantern, a delicate metal emblem that whispered of scandal and hidden truths. Down below, the ranch's barn and corral formed the heartbeat of the homestead. Caleb had taken to mending the old wooden fence that ran along the western edge of the property, a boundary that separated their sanctuary from the hostile plains beyond. His rough, callous hands, hardened by years of solitary labor, moved with a certain precision as he replaced a splintered rail. As he worked, he discovered, wedged between two battered posts, another length of charred rope. The rope was blackened and brittle, its ominous presence striking him with a familiar shiver. It was not the first such warning. Its appearance now, amid the routine of repairs, escalated a quiet dread that had begun to settle in his bones. He paused and ran a callous finger over the coarse fibers. "Not again," he muttered under his breath. There was an arrangement to these mysterious warnings, a silent message that some unseen hand wished to communicate. The charred rope's presence, like smoke in the still air, carried connotations of punishment and menace. Caleb's mind, troubled by memories of a failed cattle deal and the ghost of a friend lost to betrayal, now added this new sign to his list of omens. He tightened his grip on the hammer and resumed work, every strike echoing his internal resolve to protect his home. Later, while fetching water from the well, he noticed movement at the far end of the ranch. A lean, wandering figure had appeared on a ridge, obscured partly by the shifting silhouettes of junipers. Though Caleb could not see details clearly under the deepening twilight, a chill thought crept upon him. He knew enough of frontier life to understand such silent figures were seldom benign. But for now, the focus remained on the homestead. With steady hands, he filled a worn pail and trudged back to the house. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted with hints of disquiet from the town beyond. The local saloon in nearby Iron Hollow had been abuzz with rumors. Later that evening, as Caleb made an occasional trip into town, he encountered Tessa Cade, a gruff yet perceptive woman with whiskey-stained eyes who ran the saloon. "Caleb," she drawled as they stood near the dusty doorway of the establishment, "word is that Silas Vane's been a skin about you and that Mark girl." Her tone was casual, yet laced with urgency. "They say he's a drifter, tied up with a stolen land deal, and he takes keen interest in any young woman with a locket like hers." Tessa's words struck him like a warning bell. Silas Vane was not a name he wished to hear again, but now it surfaced with unerring precision. Back at the ranch, the ensuing hours took on a heavier note. Night deepened, and the wind carried whispers of discontent and unspoken threats. In the pale glow of a late lantern, Ruth and Nora prepared a modest supper in the cramped kitchen. Nora, who usually moved with silent reserve, was unusually distracted. While carrying a bowl of stew out to serve cold water to the chickens, her slender hand slipped, and the locket fell from her wrist with a soft clink onto the rough wooden floor. Caleb, nearby mending a loose shingle on the porch, paused. He stooped to retrieve it, brushing aside the dust with careful fingers. When he pried open the delicate clasp, a small piece of paper fluttered free, a deed fragment printed in a faded hand. The scrap bore legal notations, its edges curled from the neglect of years, and it hinted at the existence of a stolen claim on cattle land once promised in a land deal. Caleb's pulse quickened. The locket, which Nora wore silently as she carried her burden, now revealed a secret that had clearly branded her past, a connection to a fraudulent claim that had brought disgrace and envy. He reached out, and as his rough, callous hand met Nora's slender fingers to return the locket, a forbidden warmth flickered in his chest. For an instant, their hands touched, a spark of human connection that transcended the unspoken distance between them. Nora's eyes, dark and wary, lifted briefly as if to offer silent acknowledgement before she looked away. "Keep it safe," Caleb said softly, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "It's more than just a trinket, I suppose." Nora said nothing, but in her quiet gaze was 1,000 unsaid words, a mixture of gratitude, defiance, and sorrow. Later that night, as the ranch lay in a tentative sleep punctuated by the distant hoot of an owl and the gentle creak of old wood settling, Ruth confided in Caleb by the flickering light of a dying lantern on the porch. "My daughter, she ain't been free since that false theft accusation on her father's land deal. They said she was to blame, and it's that scandal that clings to her like dust. Her tone was both bitter and resigned, but beneath it lay trust in Caleb's steady presence. If you care to protect her, you'll understand the bind she's in. The locket holds more than a memory. It holds her shame. Caleb nodded, his expression somber. He recalled his own haunted past, the death of a friend in a cattle deal gone awry, and felt an empathetic pang. His inner turmoil, lifelong guilt softened by the prospect of redemption, stirred as he resolved to be a bulwark against the cruelty of a judgmental world. "They won't harm her as long as I'm here," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Outside, the wind carried a message in its mournful wail, a sound that, perhaps, was Silas Vane's shadow sliding imperceptibly along the ridge. Across the open plains, the dark figure stayed motionless for a time, before vanishing into the bleak horizon. Caleb's eyes narrowed as he remembered Tessa's warning and the note he had heard in town. The drifter's intentions, tied to the scandal and the stolen land, weighed heavily on him. There, on the freshly painted fence of corral, another charred rope lay as if freshly scorched by fire, a silent marker of impending threat. Caleb crossed the porch and peered into the smoky distance where the figures of Iron Hollow merged with the dark plains. He sensed an unsettling presence beyond the ranch's sturdy walls. Silas Vane's shadow, or perhaps an emissary of his, moved with the slow, deliberate caution of a predator. The air carried the tang of burning wood and distant gunpowder, and every creak in the night deepened his resolve. Inside, as the night wore on and the flickering light of the lantern struggled against the encroaching darkness, Ruth and Nora huddled together in the spare room. The murmurs of the wind added to the uncertainty of their future. In that moment, as Caleb lay awake on a cot in the main room, his thoughts wrestled with a rising tide of protectiveness and a silent dread that grew with each minute. The whisper of the charred rope, the dropped locket and deed fragment, and Tessa Cade's hushed warning in Iron Hollow all converged to form a single, unsettling question that clung to the night air like smoke. What does Silas Vane want with that locket? And how close is his dark shadow creeping toward us? Caleb's breathing slowed as he stared into the darkness, his mind echoing with a damp, acrid taste of fear. His hand tightened around the scarred knife he had given Ruth, a silent reminder of the trust they were beginning to forge. And even as the night deepened with the sagebrush whispering secrets of endurance and old regrets, one truth emerged clearly in his heart. He would do anything to shield Ruth and Nora from the looming threat, even if that meant facing the ghastly hand of fate that now bore Silas Vane's name. With the stolen locket's deed fragment exposed and a charred rope marking their peril, will Silas Vane's dark designs come to fruition, and how close is he to enshrouding Dustvale Ranch in night shadow? The night at Dustvale Ranch deepened into a profound silence, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood and the soft rustle of sagebrush stirred by a midnight breeze. In the barn's half-darkness, Caleb Harrow worked methodically alongside the young boy, repairing a worn harness for one of the ranch horses. Each measured strike of his hammer resonated with memories of lost promises and bitter regrets. The echoes of a friend's tragic end still haunted him. In the quiet, the steady rhythm of their work forged small bonds, even as the specter of judgment and threat crept ever nearer to their fragile haven. Across the barn's rough-hewn floor, Nora Calloway sat on a creaking stool near a small window. Her slender fingers, calloused from labor, fumbled with a piece of leather as she attempted to mend an old harness strap. For so many years, silence had been her constant companion, and tonight it clung to her like a shroud. But as she worked, she hummed a tentative tune, a faint melody that seemed to rise from the depths of her hidden sorrow. It was a sound so soft that even the wind paused to listen. Caleb watched her from a short distance, his eyes tracing the delicate movements of her hands. The sight sparked in him a mix of admiration and a forbidden tenderness he barely understood. In that moment, he recalled the scar of his own past, an old wound that still ached from a betrayal long ago, and felt an inexplicable kinship with the quiet girl. Outside, Ruth Calloway busied herself in a small corner of the kitchen, braiding fresh sagebrush among strands of her own silvery hair. Her measured hands moved with deliberate care, weaving together reminders of strength and endurance. Occasionally, she exchanged looks with Nora and offered a rare, soft smile, one that seemed to promise that even in bitterness, beauty might be found. Still, the atmosphere pulsed with an undercurrent of apprehension. Earlier in the day, Caleb's careful inspections had revealed yet another haunting sign, a third length of charred rope tied around the base of the water well. Attached to it was a burned scrap of paper, its frayed edges barely holding a single ominous phrase. Leave or burn. This new warning gnawed at Caleb's cautious heart, fueling his determination to protect his newfound family. That same evening, a bitter wind stirred dust along the fence line as Caleb stepped outside to check the boundaries of his property. He found, etched in the worn wood, an old post near the well, the unmistakable mark of a threat. Another charred, smoky rope burned into the timber. The sight made his jaw clench, and his mind wandered to the whispered rumors he had heard at the Iron Hollow saloon earlier. A drifter, Silas Vane, with a penchant for skulking on the fringes, whose name was now spoken with caution by townsfolk. Tessa Cade, the saloon's gruff keeper, had warned him that Silas was tied to a stolen land deal and was seeking a marked girl. Her words had unsettled him then and now, as the rope's char bore silent testimony to a growing menace. His unease deepened. Returning to his work in the barn, Caleb's steady hands continued to secure the harnesses and mend broken boards. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and lingering dusk, and every creak of the barn's roof reminded him that the past was never far behind. As he worked, the distant sound of footsteps outside made him glance toward the open door. There, silhouetted against the dim glow of the ranch's porch light, a group of local youth passed by, their voices low and rough as one of them hurled a clump of dirt in Nora's direction. "Thief's kin, ain't ya?" one sneered, the words laced with scandal and disdain. The remark stung, and Nora's eyes flashed with startled hurt before she returned silently to her work. Caleb's heart tightened at the sound. It was not the first time the town had passed judgment on Nora for the scandal that clung to her like a curse, the scandal of a false theft accusation that had once branded her family. He felt protectiveness surge like heat behind a locked door, pushing away the echoes of past injustice. He resolved that their small family at Dustvale Ranch would not be cowed by idle gossip. He walked slowly over to where Nora sat, her almost imperceptible humming continuing as she worked. In a soft, deliberate gesture, he reached out and gently took her hand when she looked up briefly. His rough fingers, scarred by years of hard labor, brushed against hers and lingered, a silent vow passing between them, a vow of protection and unspoken commitment, though he fought feverishly to keep his forbidden warmth in check. "Nora," he said quietly, the words careful as if they weighed as much as gold, "you carry your past clear on you, but you're stronger than they say." His tone, though stoic, was not unkind. There was an emotional crack beneath his firm exterior that he tried desperately to conceal. For a long moment, the silence stretched between them, the rumble of the wind, the creak of weathered wood, and the soft hum of her own voice were the only sounds. Then, as if breaking through the dam of her habitual silence, Nora spoke in a voice so soft it might have been mistaken for a whisper carried by the wind. "I ain't worth it." Her words, laden with raw vulnerability and shame, cut through the quiet like a shard of ice. Caleb's breath hitched, and his heart pounded painfully. This was the first time she had spoken. Not a command or a retort, but a true utterance of her wounded self. "No," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "You're worth every single bit." The declaration, though scarcely louder than the murmur of the old barn, resounded deeply within him. He squeezed her hand, silently vowing that he would shield her from the cruelty of a world that had already taken so much from them. Ruth, who had been quietly overseeing the household duties in the adjacent room, stepped out and looked upon their exchange with eyes that held both concern and reluctant hope. Later that night, after the youth had gone and the acrid smell of discontent had gradually faded into the backdrop of the ranch's timeless isolation, Caleb returned to the well to fetch water. His boots kicked up little puffs of dust that mingled with the cool night air. As he leaned over the rim of the well, his eyes fixed on the inky darkness below, he could not shake the feeling that the threat was drawing closer, even as the silence of the night belied it. The weight of the charred rope and the burned note had already woven a tapestry of dread into his thoughts. Now, amplified by Nora's tentative words, that fear sharpened like a knife's edge. He brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead and looked toward the ridge where he had glimpsed Silas Vane's presence in earlier hours. A dark, almost imperceptible silhouette against a sky littered with stars. That silhouette now seemed to hang nearer, as though drawn by the unresolved tension of the night. Every sensation, the distant clamor of a night bird, the dampness emanating from the cool earth, and the soft sigh of the wind through the junipers, seemed a whisper of impending danger. Caleb returned to the barn, where the night's labor had slowed, and the only sounds were the whispered rustling of straw and the measured beats of his own pulse. The memory of Nora's soft, trembling words lingered with him, intertwining with his own shame and guilt. How could a girl so burdened by the weight of scandal be so invaluable? His heart, long hardened by the loss and lonely nights of Dustvale, broke silently, yet he knew he must bury any forbidden stirrings of warmth deep inside. His duty was clear: protect Nora, protect Ruth, and shield this newfound family against the advancing shadows cast by Silas Vane. As midnight edged closer, Caleb found a brief moment to sit upon the creaking porch steps, the cold seeping into his worn boots and mingling with his troubled thoughts. His eyes never left the dark horizon, where he sensed the drifter's malevolence gathering like clouds before a storm. In those quiet moments, every whispered thought and every beat of his heart became prayer, that they might weather the storm of shame and judgment. The fragile bond that had begun to form demanded nurturing amid the hardship. A final swirl of wind carried with a faint, unsettling noise, a murmur of disturbance in the distance that set Caleb's nerves taut. The sound, blending with the lonesome whistle of the sagebrush, was a chilling reminder that the threat was far from over. As he rose from the steps, his hand still warm from his touch on Nora's, he resolved to dig deeper into the dark tidings that plagued Dustvale Ranch. The burning echo of that midnight confession, "I ain't worth it," spurred him onward, igniting a fierce determination to rewrite the narrative of shame with a promised protection instead. In the heavy silence that followed, as the ranch surrendered to night and every creak and murmur pulsed with latent dread, Caleb's mind coalesced into a single, haunting question. Will Silas Vane's growing threat and the weight of Nora's shame consume us entirely, or can I, with all I have, shield this family into a brighter morrow? With the bitter truth of a whispered confession and the ominous presence of a drifter drawing ever nearer, will Caleb's vow be enough to hold back the encroaching shadows of shame, or will the specter of the past overwhelm this fledgling family? A bitter wind rattled the eaves of Dustvale Ranch as darkness settled over land like a shroud. The air carried the sharp tang of smoke and the moisture of an oncoming storm. In the far-off hollow, where the sagebrush grew sparse and the rocky ground opened into a desolate basin, a sinister glow began to spread. It was fire, an inferno set to flush out those who hid behind secrets. Caleb Harrow, his heart heavy with old regrets and new resolve, felt apprehension coil in his chest as he prepared for the unknown. It began quietly enough, with a flicker of orange light at the edge of property. In the distance, near the base of a stony gully, flames licked upward and thick smoke curled into the starless sky. Caleb's years on a ranch had taught him that fire was both destroyer and cleanser. Now, it appeared as a weapon wielded against his fragile haven. Without hesitation, he reached for his flintlock rifle and strode toward the corral, where the defensive barricades had been hastily arranged. Every step stirred up clouds of dust and the low-scented musk of burnt sage. His scarred hands, used to mending fences and forging a life out of barren earth, now trembled with purpose. As Caleb advanced toward the direction of the fire, he caught sight of two figures emerging from the smoky haze. They rode with crude, desperate urgency on horses spurred into nervous gallop. Their silhouettes, distorted by the dancing flames, confirmed his worst suspicions. These were not mere drifters passing by, but hired men sent by Silas Vane. The drifter, whose presence had haunted earlier whispers on the wind, now made his intentions known by orchestrating a night assault. His objective was clear: retrieve the locket that Nora Calloway wore and its hidden deed fragment, a symbol of scandal and shame that had burdened her for so long. Back at the ranch, Ruth Calloway clutched a worn shawl as she secured the kitchen door, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. The children were tucked into the barn. The boy kept his tool within reach, and the girl clutched a ragged doll. Ruth's face, lined with hardship and quiet hope, tightened as she recalled the rumors that had long marked their lives in Iron Hollow. Now, as the inferno began to rouse terror from the hollow, she sensed that Silas Vane's threat was no idle word. Her voice was steady when she said, "We must not let them force us out." Inside, the murmur of whispered prayers and determined breaths filled the modest home. Caleb, positioned at the corral, took aim as one of the hired men spurred his horse toward a weak spot near the barn. The air exploded with the crack of a flintlock shot, and the rider veered sharply, smoke trailing from his jacket. "Hold them off," Caleb barked, his voice slicing through the wind. His rifle discharged again. Each shot was measured, each bullet a promise that he would not yield his ground. The hired men, though relentless, found themselves met with the raw, unyielding determination of a man who had spent too long in guilt and solitude to allow his new family to be harmed. Lighting danced along the edges of the chaos as the fire in the hollow grew bolder, its heat spreading like a noose around the ranch. Caleb's eyes narrowed as he spied movement among the billowing flames. A man lean and ragged with eyes that burned with malicious intent. Who must be Silas Vane? The drifter's face was obscured by the shadows and swirling smoke, but his presence was unmistakable. He rode with languid savagery, as though time slowed around him to savor each moment of his assault. With a guttural cry, he signaled his men forward, and the newest wave of attackers surged with renewed ferocity. In the melee that followed, Caleb fought with a determination born of countless lonely battles. His flintlock cracked, sending shots that knocked men from their horses. The hiss of gunpowder mingled with the roar of flames and the anguished cries of those caught unawares. Amid the tumult, a bullet grazed his shoulder. A searing pain flared through him, but he stifled a cry and pressed on. The air was now thick with the acrid stench of burning wood and scorched earth, a reminder that every victory against the drifters was hard-won and soaked in sacrifice. Within the barn, Nora's quiet hum had grown louder, a trembling counterpoint to the din outside. With instinct born of fear and determination, she moved among the shadows, collecting lengths of sturdy rope and bent twigs, and set her makeshift snares along a narrow gully leading away from the ranch. Though silent, her actions spoke with a clarity that belied her years. Ruth watched with both pride and trepidation as her daughter, her voice long stifled by disgrace and gossip, assumed the role of protector in a way she had never dared imagine. As the firing subsided into a cacophony of panicked shouts and clattering hooves, Tessa Kate arrived at Dustvale Ranch astride a tired horse. The saloon keeper's leather-clad face, lined with years of hardship and hardened by frontier justice, bore the stern look of one who had seen too much misfortune. Clutching her ledger tightly, she dismounted beside Caleb. "I'd done my part in Iron Hollow," Tessa said in a low, steady tone. "And I brought word Silas Vane's done more than threaten. He's out for the locket in that girl's hand. And the deed it hides. He'll not be satisfied until he robs you of everything." Her words, gruff yet laced with protective kindness, bolstered Caleb's resolve as he nodded in silent understanding. With Tessa's timely arrival, the tide of chaos began to shift. The townsfolk she had rallied, hard-bitten men and women who'd grown weary of drifter tyranny, converged on a ranch, their presence reinforcing every barricade and emboldening every flintlock shot. Though the fire in the hollow still crackled like a desperate heartbeat, the attackers' ranks thinned as fear spread among them. Caleb's eyes, stinging with sweat and pain, fixed once more on the spectral figure of Silas Vane, who watched from afar and then, with a final sneer, spurred his remaining men into retreat. But victory came at a steep price. Caleb's wounded shoulder throbbed as he leaned against a post, still clutching his rifle with resolute determination. Nearby, Nora emerged from the shadows, her fingers trembling as she gathered the scattered pieces of rope from the ground. In a moment of tender defiance, she hid the locket within a bundle of fresh sagebrush at the edge of the barn, away from prying eyes and greedy hands. Her subtle act, though quiet, carried the weight of all her shame and secret desires for a life unburdened by past judgment. Ruth, standing at the doorway with her eyes moist yet unwavering, approached Caleb slowly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They had weathered the storm together, and now the true cost of survival was etched in every bruise and every scar on this rugged land. With a weary glance at the scorched remnants of the gate where a final charred rope had been affixed, Caleb understood that Silas Vane's threat was far from vanquished. "He'll come back," Caleb whispered as he looked at Tessa, his voice a mix of resignation and determination. "He always does." As the flames in the hollow dwindled to glowing embers and the townsfolk began their measured cleanup, Caleb knelt beside Nora, gently placing his scarred, steadfast knife into her hand once more. "Keep it safe," he murmured, voice rough with unspoken emotion. "And know I'll always protect you, no matter how dark the night." Nora's eyes, wide and haunted by the events of the night, met his briefly. Then, in a brittle, defiant whisper that cut through the lingering smoke, she said, "I ain't worth it." The words, raw and wrenching, hung heavy between them, and within them, Caleb felt a surge of forbidden warmth he would struggle to contain. Under the shrouded sky, as the last vestiges of battle smoldered, a final, bitter question clawed at Caleb's heart. With Silas Vane's threat echoing like a curse across the ranch and a locket's secret buried in the sagebrush as both shame and a promise of dawn, he wondered, even as relief mingled with lingering dread, will Silas return for the locket's secret? Or can I, with all my scar heart, shield my new family from the drifter's final strike? With the fire's embers fading and Silas Vane's threat still looming in the cold night, can Caleb's vow, tempered in sacrifice and steadfast protection, secure a future for Ruth, Nora, and his own wounded soul? Dawn spilled slowly and tenderly over Dust Vale Ranch, bathing the weathered earth in hues of warm amber and soft rose. The night's terrors, anger, fear, and fire had ebbed into the past. Now the land, scarred but resilient, breathed fresh promise beneath a clear, untroubled sky. Caleb Harrow stood on his creaking porch, his eyes tracing the distant line where the rugged canyon met the horizon. His shoulders still ached from the confrontation, and every bruise on his skin testified to a night of grim sacrifice. Yet now his thoughts turned to healing rather than torment, to the life he must forge for his newfound family. Earlier that dark night, driven by Nora's unspoken determination and guided by her subtle tracking, Caleb had pursued the elusive Silas Vane into a narrow canyon, where jagged rocks and shadowed crags held court over the land. There, amid the echoing stillness and the poignant hush of early morning's approach, a tense standoff had unfolded. Silas, gaunt and driven by a simmering greed, had demanded the secret held within Nora's locket, the very piece of a deed that revealed a stolen claim. Caleb, his flintlock rifle steady in hand despite pain, had used the canyon's natural cover and the grit of the desert to outmaneuver his foe. Tessa Cade, the stalwart keeper of Bitter Sage's battered ledger, had ridden in with a handful of determined townsfolk just as Silas's men faltered. With the ledger's grim testimony ringing in every word, Silas's ambition found no purchase. Caught off balance, he was forced into flight, vanishing into the labyrinth of rocky outcrops. Yet before his escape, he had left a final, haunting token, a length of charred rope nailed to the old gate, its dark fibers a bitter promise that his threat was not entirely extinguished. Now, as the echo of conflict softened into memory, Caleb's mind returned to the heart of Dust Vale Ranch. Inside the modest main house, Ruth Calloway and Nora sat together in the quiet kitchen. Ruth's eyes shone with a tempered relief as she stirred a pot of stew over the low flame, while Nora, her posture still guarded yet less haunted than before, cleaned a battered dish. The house smelled warmly of simmering beans and smoky wood. a scent that even a harsh frontier could not entirely erase. Outside, the ranch lay bathed in the soft glow of morning, each element a testament to endurance. The ancient sagebrush, the creaking barn, and even the faded ropes that had marked much sorrow now began to vanish beneath fresh paint and tender care. Caleb stepped over onto the porch, his boots stirring up slight puffs of dust as he clutched the scarred knife he had earlier entrusted to Nora. That knife, emblematic of both his guilt and his unwavering duty, now felt lighter in his hand, as if the burden of past failures was easing with the birth of a new day. Nora, emerging from the shadows of the kitchen, hesitated briefly before meeting his gaze. In that silent moment of recognition, a gentle collision of spirit and resolve. Her dark eyes conveyed more than words ever could. There was an unspoken promise in the space between them. A promise that she belonged here, that she was worth protection he now vowed to extend. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Caleb gathered with Tessa and a small band of townsfolk in the center of Bitter Sage. In the square near the weathered telegraph office, they pored over Tessa's ledger. The pages, stained by years of hardship, recounted Silas Vane's past misdeeds with unyielding clarity. His ties to a fraudulent land deal and his relentless pursuit of what he believed was his birthright were laid bare in grim detail. The townsfolk, grizzled from life's harsh truths, murmured their assent in low voices. Together, they agreed that justice must now be served, not driven by rage, but by a measured resolve to restore the honor of their community. It was decided that Silas Vane, if he ever returned, would find Bitter Sage no longer a place of easy prey. Back at Dustvale Ranch, while the community set about repairing the damage wrought by the attack, Caleb led Ruth and Nora outside. They walked together to the old water well at the edge of the property, a relic in need of renewal. It was here that Ruth, with trembling yet determined hands, produced a faded deed fragment from within Nora's locket. The small, brittle paper, nearly lost among the other secrets of the past, was now to become a symbol of hope. This land, Ruth said softly, more to herself than anyone else, was once stolen from our family, but now we can claim it for something good. Her voice was both sorrowful and resolute, a quiet vow to transmute shame into redemption. Caleb listened, his eyes dark and solemn. He understood that the deed fragment was not merely a record of past injustice, but a key to reclaiming what had been lost. "We'll use it," he murmured, "to fund a well for the town or even a school. Let it be our testament that a past steeped in regret cannot dictate our future." His words, uttered with the weight of a man who had finally found a reason to contend with his inner demons, resounded with quiet power. In that moment, the stolen claim and its associated scandal transformed into a promise of community and enduring strength. Later that afternoon, in a secluded corner of the ranch, Nora knelt among newly planted sagebrush saplings. The tender green shoots, barely breaking through the hard, dusty soil, reminded her of the fragile beginnings that could one day become a thriving grove. With careful hands, she set the locket aside in a small woven basket and pressed a tiny sapling into the earth. The act, simple yet profoundly symbolic, marked the planting of new roots and the forging of a future rooted in renewal rather than shame. She did not speak a word as she worked. Her quiet determination was enough. Yet, in the stillness, a single phrase escaped her lips, a soft murmur that cut through the ever-present silence. "Maybe I'm worth something." The words, raw and unpracticed, hung in the air like a benediction. Caleb, having watched from a distance, felt a swell of forbidden warmth and paternal pride, an emotion tinged with the bittersweet residue of his own buried longings. He knew that his feelings must remain carefully channeled, for he had not wished to fall in love, but only to protect. Yet, as he observed Nora's quiet transformation, his heart softened further. He walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're worth every bit of this new dawn," he said, his voice low and steady, laden with the unspoken promise of a future built on trust and hard-won courage. Ruth, who had been quietly tending a small hearth outside near the rebuilt barn door, looked on with a mixture of pride and caution. She had long guarded her daughter's secrets, And though her heart was heavy with the memories of past accusations and false thefts that had branded Nora, she now saw a glimmer of hope in the soft smile that played upon Nora's lips. "We've come far," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling like the last light of dusk. "We're not defined by what they say." Her words merged with the gentle rustle of the sagebrush and the distant hum of life resuming in bitter sage. As dusk fell again, cooling the bright promise of the day, Caleb gathered his new family on the porch. The sky, a vast expanse of indigo slowly giving way to the final traces of twilight, mirrored the uncertain future that lay ahead. One forged from both bitter shadows and the quiet vow of a new beginning. With steady eyes, Caleb spoke softly, "We fought hard for this peace. But I wonder, as new trials approach, will our dawn hold, or will fresh shadows test the strength of what we built?" His question, directed into the vast openness of the night, hung in the air as if awaiting an answer from the silent stars. The charred ropes that once marked warnings had been painted over and hidden away. The scars on the gate, symbols of past aggression, were now covered by a new coat of weathered paint, a testament to resilience and the promise of healing. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of found family and the soft murmur of the wind through sagebrush, the heart of Dustvale Ranch beat with cautious hope. Caleb's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the valley of bitter sage lay quiet and still. As he watched, he could almost see the faces of those who had once passed judgment, and he knew that they would soon learn that redemption is not gained by clinging to old slights, but by forging bonds strong enough to defy the weight of shame. The ranch and the community beyond had been tempered by hardship and fear for too long. Now, with a new school to be funded from the reclaimed deed, with the Lockett's secret transformed into a beacon for community restoration, and with the bitter memory of Silas Vane's threats slowly receding into the distance, hope had found its foothold. Celebrations would come, quiet and measured, as children learned beneath the shade of newly planted sagebrush, and townsfolk whisper how even the harshest of winters could yield a gentle spring. Standing on the porch as darkness gathered once more, Caleb held the scar knife, a symbol of past guilt and present resolve, firmly in his hand. He did not speak of his forbidden warmth, his once hidden longings now tempered into a deep, protective respect. Instead, he let his eyes say what his words could not, that this new family, forged in adversity and bound by mutual hope, was his redemption. In the quiet of the approaching night, as the stars began their slow, silent vigil over bitter sage, Caleb's final thought echoed softly in the chill air. Will our hard-won dawn hold against tomorrow's trials, or will new shadows cast their long doubts upon this fragile peace?